At the beginning of the second book of the Republic, the argument is resumed, and it's taken up and radicalized by Glaucon and Adeimantus. Glaucon and Adeimantus are the key interlocutors for Socrates because they're the upcoming talented, potentially virtuous youth of Athens, and he wants to educate them in political knowledge and in moral knowledge. And Socrates is held off by Glaucon and Adeimantus, and Glaucon goes first because Glaucon is most brave in all things, as it says at the beginning of Book 2. And since he was associated with Socrates at the very beginning of the dialogue, it seems there's some sort of affinity between Socrates and Glaucon from the very outset. Now, Glaucon and Adeimantus are brothers, and they're both Plato's brothers. So he's writing his own family members and his talented, capable brothers into the dialogue, the most famous of the Platonic dialogues. So he immortalizes his own family, which has a considerable status within Athens, and he shows or gives a microcosm of what a good education for talented youth might be like. Well, Glaucon says to Socrates, after this very dubious win over Thrasymachus, Socrates, do you wish to persuade us, or really persuade us, or just seem to persuade us? Now, this difference between being and seeming is crucial to all the dialogues. In some ways, the source of philosophy is to be found in the distinction between the way things appear to be and the way they really are. This being and seeming distinction is very important to Socrates and to philosophy. It's not at all important to the sophists. Sophists say, well, look, I don't care whether I seem to persuade you or really persuade you. So long as you act as if I have persuaded you, it's nothing to me. So the difference between being and seeming is analogous to the difference between Socrates and philosophy and Thrasymachus and sophistry. So when Glaucon asks the loaded question, do you want to really persuade us or do you want to seem to persuade us? All of the philosophical points that Socrates makes to distinguish himself from the sophists are implied and brought into play there. So this being and seeming corresponds to the difference, for example, between words and definitions. You'll notice that no sophist in any of the dialogues ever spend any time defining any terms. Sophists thrive on ambiguity. Socrates, on the other hand, is going to move from words to definitions, from words or symbols to meanings, because he thrives on the light, he thrives on real articulate knowledge, knowledge which is held together logically by a logos, all right, an account or a reason. And Socrates, of course, rises to the challenge, a challenge which he set up by beating Thrasymachus badly, by offering bad arguments, by making the defense of justice look kind of wishy-washy. He has lured Thrasymachus, or lured Adeimantus and Glaucon into this argument. So that's why he gives, I think, fairly weak arguments against Thrasymachus. Glaucon says, if you really want to persuade us, rather than just seem to persuade us, we have to have a radicalized conception of justice, and I want you to prove that justice is good in and of itself, that justice is good as an end, not as a means. And to do this, he says, look, what we're going to have to do is look at what people say about justice and have you defend justice even in its most unattractive, or at least apparently unattractive form. Imagine, and he comes up with the theory, with the myth of Gyges here. Glaucon says, look, imagine what happened with Gyges' ancestor. Gyges was the king of Lydia. He says, his ancestor was a shepherd for the king. One day, the earth opened up. He went down, and going up and down is going to be very important in this book. Whenever you see anybody going up or going down in this book, underline it. So down the shepherd goes, shepherd and sheep. Think about Thrasymachus in the first book of the Republic, right, saying that the shepherd is interested not in the flock but in his own benefit. The shepherd goes down and he sees a big bronze horse. Within the bronze horse is a man larger than life size, and he's wearing a ring. Takes the ring off the shepherd, and he goes back up and he finds that when this ring is turned inside out, so that the collar is down rather than up, it makes him invisible. As a result of this invisibility, he goes and he kills the king, he becomes a regicide, he has sex with the king's wife, and he takes control of the state. Key point here is that by having the ring of, well, first of all, hollow horses play a very, very big role in Greek poetry. Right? So it's a clear implied dig at Homer, right? I mean, it could have been a hollow anything. It's a hollow horse, and it's bronze. And in a little while, we'll find out what bronze means, too, right? It means emotion or appetite. And this man goes down, so he moves from a state of at least naivete, if not knowledge, down to a morally inferior state, to a state of moral ignorance, and comes back up, not improved, but made worse. this bad education, because I think that the myth of Gyges is a parable about a bad education, comes back up and then subverts the political and moral order by committing adultery with the king's wife, killing the king and taking control of the state. Bad education then leads to bad political results. All right, so foreshadowing some of the main themes of the Republic. The criticism of Homer is there. And this invisibility element means that what we're doing is essentially subtracting the body and looking just at the soul. Now, Glaucon says, think about this, Socrates. Suppose a just man and an unjust man were to get this ring of Gyges. The unjust man would clearly do all kinds of unjust things. He would kill the king, have sex with the king's wife, and do all the things that he wanted to do. The just man, let's face it, would do exactly the same thing. Because people are just and good only because they lack the capacity to do real injustice. In other words, they're weak and feeble. And if people got the opportunity to do justice with impunity, no one would do justice. They would have a good time and they would do all kinds of bad stuff. So what this would mean then, it radicalizes Thrasymachus' argument in the following sense. Thrasymachus says that justice is the advantage of the stronger. What Glaucon is essentially suggesting is that justice is the advantage of the weaker. What he says is that lots of weak people that were incapable of becoming real tyrants got together and they said, you know, it's better for us to form something like a social contract so that we don't have to put up with having injustice done to us, and we'll give up on doing injustice to other people because it hurts us more to have injustice done to us than it pleases us to do injustice to other people. And besides, we're kind of feeble, incapable, kind of pious people, so that's no good for us. The best we can do then, according to Glaucon, is create a social contract which limits injustice, even though everybody really knows that that's what's good for them and that's what they really want. So Glaucon is essentially making an argument that might be made by someone called, or by an immoralist. In other words, we only do justice conventionally by nature. If we could do, we only do justice conventionally by nature, we would do injustice because that's naturally better for us. He is replicating a distinction that is common among the sophists of Greece at the time, the distinction between nomos and phusis. Nomos is political law in the sense of convention, law in the sense that you get speeding tickets. Phusis is natural law in the sense of the law of gravity, right? One is, the nomos is created by legislatures, it's created by human beings. It's a set of conventions. Nature has its own laws that are independent of those. Well, Socrates wants to collapse that distinction. That's going to be a big part of the Republic. But for now, in Glaucon's radicalization of the argument for injustice, he's doing the opposite. He's saying, no, look, by nature people want to be unjust, and that's good for them because it makes them happy. It gratifies their desires. But they invent these conventions to prevent themselves from being taken advantage of because they're weak. Now, the brother, Adeimantus, chimes in and says, before you go anywhere, Socrates, let me explain to you that it's going to get even worse than this. Men, when they tell their sons that they must be just, they always tell them, look, you should be just because of what it gets you. If you have a reputation for being a just man, you can get elected to office. You can be made general of an army. You can rise high in the estimation of your neighbors. But they always praise justice, not because it's good intrinsically, but rather because it's good for what it gets you. It's good because of the reputation you get. And also, of course, they praise justice because the gods like justice and there'll be divine retribution in the afterlife. Now, Adeimantus says, stop and think about this for a second. All right? Adeimantus says, look, people make mistakes. So if you're really smart at being unjust, what you would do is seem just and seem good and seem virtuous and then be as bad as you possibly can. This is the argument that Machiavelli makes if you stop and think about it. Right? I mean, you should get away with whatever you can, but you should look like you're a real good, virtuous person. If you do that, then you have the best of both worlds, because then you get to be unjust, and in addition, you get the reputation for justice, so you get all the good things that come to the man who's reputed just. And Adeimantus says, in addition, even though the gods don't make that kind of mistake, they're not interested in reputation, they can be bought. Remember what Cephalus did by giving sacrifices? Well, suppose you become a tyrant or you do all kinds of injustice and you accumulate a tremendous amount of money and you take control of various holy places and you can perform the appropriate rites. In other words, you give the gods a percentage. Right? And if you buy the gods off, you perform the right number of sacrifices, they'll be willing to forego their wrath. There'll be no divine retribution. So if a really unjust man were to be wise in his injustice, and he were to get the reputation among men for being very virtuous, and in addition he were to buy the gods off, he's all set. That shows you that injustice really is better. So now they radicalize the argument together. They say, look, or Glaucon says, there are three kinds of good. There are things that are good in and of themselves, like health for the body. That's just a good thing for itself. There are things that are good for what they get you, like, like wealth. Wealth, if you have it, you can exchange for other things, and that's good for what it will get you. And there are other things that are good both for themselves and for what they get you. And that kind of thing of good that's both a means and an end, that's the kind of thing that we would like to see that we would like to see as our third kind of justice. Now, take away all reputation, take away all the things you get from justice, show us that justice is good in and of itself, that justice is to the soul what health is to the body. It's a hard argument. In addition, let's take the radical proposal there. Suppose a good man, as the opposite of what Adeimantus was saying, a good man is reputed to be unjust. And people think him bad, and they confiscate all his property, and he's whipped and burned and killed and has terrible things done to him. Show us that that life of the virtuous man who is reputed to be unjust and who has terrible things done to him, show us that that's a happier life than the unjust man that gets away with it. A very difficult problem. I mean, it looks like Socrates has been dug into a very deep hole here. In other words, he has to show that justice and the virtue of the soul is good independent of all other extraneous features. And even if it gets what it doesn't deserve, even if it gets the wrong reputation among men, and think about the fact that Socrates is going to be an extremely just man who has a reputation that's the opposite of what it truly ought to be, and the result is that he is killed by ignorant, unjust men. This is not just an intellectual exercise. This is gesturing back at the trial and death of Socrates. Right? He's the unjust man he's the just man reputed to be unjust that gets the consequences of the ignorance of the people around him. So Socrates is stuck. I mean, he says, well, I'm just overwhelmed by the magnitude of your task. Now, in some ways, it's quite proper that he should be. It's a very difficult argument. On the second hand, though, it's also true that Socrates has been waiting for this argument. He's been stepping back a little bit, waiting for these boys to come on to give him an argument and make the hardest possible play in defense of justice. So Socrates says, I have an idea. And he introduces one of the main metaphors or one of the main similes in the Republic. Suppose we don't look at an individual man, because it'll be hard to see justice or virtue of the soul if we look at an individual. Let's look at the city. Let's construct a city in speech. And this city in speech will show us the virtues of the individual man, magnified manyfold. And by seeing a large magnification of the virtue and vice of the soul and its weal and woe, we'll be able to find out what the status of justice is and whether it really is intrinsically good or not. So the Glaucon and Adeimantus, brave, virtuous young men, say, okay, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Let's jump on it. So Adeimantus leads off in his discussion with Socrates. And for the rest of Book 2, they construct the minimum city, based upon the idea of the division of labor, and it's called the city of utmost necessity. You get 5 or 6 or 10 men together who are exchanging the products of their labor. All right? One man, one job is established as the ideal because the division of labor, so that each man takes one job, means that each will be able to pursue one craft and pursue it well. You find that the jack of all trades is master of none. So we'll have a shoemaker, we'll have a cloth maker, we'll have a farmer, we'll have an iron worker. And what will happen is that this city of utmost necessity will be tolerably just, but will not have any luxuries, and will not have anything in the way of cultivation. In other words, there won't be any leisure left over for these people to develop things like civilization, like Greek culture. There won't be much in the way of poetry or statues or large public buildings. They'll live a sort of Arcadian, in a sort of Arcadian simplicity. Well, Glaucon steps into the argument at that point and says, look, this is not my kind of city. Glaucon is a brave kind of guy, and he likes to get a little bit extra. He has that heroic tendency, which could be very dangerous if he goes into political life without a thorough knowledge of political things. Right? I mean, the most virtuous and noble nature with a bad education will turn out to be the worst sort of person. So Glaucon comes in and says, no, this is a city of pigs. This is not appropriate to human beings. These people that are going to live in this simple life, they're not going to have any of the nice things. No relishes, no couches, no lovely things. Well, Socrates says, you're right. This city of utmost necessity, this sort of non-luxurious city, isn't going to satisfy most truly human desires. It'll only satisfy our animal instincts. So what will we have to add to have a more entertaining city? Well, we'll have to have things like luxurious food, and we'll have to have various kinds of imports and exports, and we're going to have a hustle and bustle of foreigners coming through, and trade relations and commerce. And of course, this means that we're going to have, first of all, more doctors, because luxury will lead to various kinds of physical maladies in the individuals, but the implication is always that anytime that the physical individual is sick, or that the soul of the individuals that make up a society are sick, you will have a soul-sick political order as well. So disorder in the individual body or soul means that there will be disorder in the collectivity. The city is like the man. So what we're going to get when we go beyond these moderate, kind of minimal desires, is we're going to have a great need for doctors, and various kinds of other luxurious trades will come in. There'll be, cosmetics, and there'll be various kinds of beautiful poetry and various kinds of art, and also there'll be war. The source of war is in luxurious life. In other words, by trying to get more than you really need, by trying to accumulate what you don't really have a need for, what you merely desire, you're going to have to end up extending the borders of your society and taking what's not yours. So we're going to need a couple of new things in this improved, or at least more luxurious city, what Socrates calls the feverish city. This feverish city will need doctors to take care of it, but also it will doubtless need what doctors are to bodies. This city will need some sort of political official to take care of it, right, to have, to cure the ills that are generated by that. And we will need some sort of soul doctor or political doctor. And that soul doctor or political doctor will end up being the philosopher king, one that can remedy these things by purging the city of the dangerous luxuries, by changing the dangerous organization of the soul of of people making up this city. Well, they put together the feverish city, and now Socrates says, how are we going to get somebody to rule this city? In other words, they're going to need some sort of political order for it, and it can't be this Arcadian simplicity that we had in the city of pigs. The best thing that we're going to get is noble men that can wield weapons, that are warriors, that will keep the laws and make sure that they're enforced. But the difficulty is this: how are we going to get these people not to be tyrannical? In other words, once they have control of the means of coercion, how is it that they're not just going to run the city for their own good? You don't want Thrasymachus and people like Thrasymachus given all the weapons in the city and allowed to dominate. They'll become tyrannical, and our happiness, which is a very dubious happiness, the happiness of luxury to begin with, will be made even more wretched. All the luxuries will go to them, and we will have a terrible factionalized city. Well, Glaucon doesn't know, and Socrates says, you know what? This reminds me of philosophical dogs. Now, this is one of the kind of inside jokes in the Republic. The idea of a philosophical dog is dopey, but it ties into a number of metaphors we've already used. Remember the distinction between the shepherd and the sheep? Well, what's in between the shepherd and the sheep is the sheepdog, works for the shepherd, but you wouldn't want the sheepdog to eat the sheep. All right, that comes back to the first book of the Republic. Well, Socrates says, well, here's a great thing about philosophical dogs, and clearly this is meant as broad humor. They like what they know. In other words, if a dog knows you, it doesn't matter if you're a good man or a bad man, so long as the dog knows you, he'll come up and lick your hand and it won't be a problem. But even if a virtuous stranger comes up, the dog barks. He doesn't like strangers. So what we want then in our guardians, in these people that will control the laws, control the politics of our city, we want them to know their own, to know the members of their city, to know the institutions of their city, and to love their city, and to be antagonistic to others. This will defend us from others, and this will allow us to exert our control over others, because we're going to have to expand. Right? One of the results of this luxury is an expansionistic foreign policy. Well, they say, how shall we educate our warriors then in such a way as to make them like philosophical dogs, so that they love what they know, but on the other hand, are antagonistic to that which is external and foreign. In other words, this antagonism to the external and to the foreign is an antagonism towards change, towards things that are different. Plato, throughout this book, is going to be fighting a running battle against history. He says, stop the world, stop historical development, I want this to be frozen in time. Once Plato gets a good city, a good political order, well, then any change is deterioration. So that means that once you get it right, if we manage to find out what the ideal good city is, then we have to completely arrest all changes. One of the most important mechanisms for the arresting of change is to create a warrior elite that is antagonistic to all innovation. Remember that in the ancient world, to call someone an innovator is generally speaking a put down. It's an accusation. Nowadays, in a kind of much more modern society that we have today, to call someone an innovator is praise. 25 centuries ago, it was not praise, it was an accusation. So what Plato wants to do is eliminate all innovation. He's going to get the job right the first time, figure out what the good society is, and that's capital T, the good society. And then once we do that, freeze all change. The way to do that is to make the rulers like philosophical dogs. They love their own. All right, and their own is the city. All right, now how will we educate these philosophical dogs? Well, two things minimally we'll have to give them. We'll have to give them a music education, and here I don't mean just playing the piano. What I mean is an education in the muses, in all the arts, poetry and literature and music and dance and things of that kind. Because that softens the hard nature of our guardians, and that makes them harmonious. And harmonious souls are one of the key things for Plato, this harmonious connection between the various elements in the soul. And in addition, they'll have to study gymnastics, because gymnastics makes the body tough and lean and vigorous and capable. And the point is that gymnastic training is to the body what music training is to the soul. Not in the restricted sense, but in the enlarged sense of music. So Platonic education for these guardians will be addressed to the needs of the body and the needs of the soul using the muses and gymnastic. And the result will be superior creatures. In other words, people with good educations will have good bodies and good souls. They will look like those beautifully austere classical Greek statues. Have you ever seen any of those, even the Roman copies of them? They're just lovely. I mean, they're very moving, and there's a certain sort of ideal which you know that the sculptor had in his mind when he decided to cut that out of the rock. Well, Plato is doing something analogous. He is cutting an ideal, not out of rock, but out of words. But if you think about what the ideal guardian will look like, it will look like the gymnasts at the Olympics. They are just perfect bodies. In addition to that, much more important than that, is the fact that they will have analogous souls. Souls that have been developed and exercised and trained so that they are the epitome, the high point of what human beings can possibly be, both in body and soul. This is, I think, one of the great achievements of Greek culture, this unity of body and soul. Now in Plato, the body becomes something of a problem and it becomes somewhat superfluous, or not superfluous, but becomes less important than the mind. Right? It's kind of a change over from Homer. But this concern about the health or happiness, the good state of the soul and the body is crucial to this kind of an education. All right? So the guardian is going to be given the muses and gymnastics. Now, when we teach them the muses, what are we going to teach them? Well, the educator of Greece is Homer. And Plato, one of the big targets of Book 3 of the Republic, is the attack on Homer. Here's what's going on there. Plato knows that the most influential educational figure in Greek life is Homer, and almost all young men, because they're the only ones that get much in the way of an education, are taught Homer from their boyhood on, and they know a quote from Homer for just about every circumstance. The difficulty is that Homer gives immoral advice, and his heroes do immoral things. The wrath of Achilles is not the behavior of a good man. Right? The lies of Odysseus suggest that Odysseus is a little too clever for his own good. They are constantly doing immoral things, and if they get away with it, Homer praises them. So the difficulty is that Homer has been influential, but his influence has been largely pernicious. Plato thinks that one of the greatest sources of political evil and moral evil in the Athens of his time is the fact that people have gotten a bad education from Homer. Plato intends to be the new Homer. He's going to be the new educator of Greece. And he's got a new ideal that he's going to set above the Homeric hero. And that's the Socratic hero. The hero of knowledge rather than the hero of slaughter. The whole point, a little later on, I'll get to this in a second, the whole point of subordinating the silver class, the class of heroic warriors who fight bravely in the interest of the city, subordinating them to the gold, is the revaluation of all values. They're demoting the Homeric hero from the top of the line of Greek heroes down to number 2. This will be heroism or warrior prowess under the guidance and direction of knowledge. That's what the difference between silver and bronze is all about. In other words, he's demoting the Homeric hero and offering Greece a new and higher and finer ideal. Socrates over Achilles. Socrates is the new Achilles. Socrates in the Apology directly compares himself to Achilles. Why? Well, first of all, because the only only poet that the audience is likely to know is Homer. And he's trying to get right in the audience's face by saying, well, look, I'm dressed in shabby stuff and I'm an old man and I haven't done very much in war lately. On the other hand, I'm a tremendously heroic individual. Would that you understood it. So Plato is making that argument again and again in the Republic, that the Homeric hero is a pre-literate, old-fashioned, evil hero that has a bad effect on our new literate, numerate culture. We have to have a new hero of knowledge, not slaughter. That's a heroism that has come and gone. So Plato intends to wrap up Greek culture, I mean, in the sense of creating new moral ideals. Nietzsche would really have liked this project. It's a revaluation of all values. Well, he gives a whole bunch of quotes from Homer in the beginning, and they're all references to Achilles and what a wicked man Achilles is. Now, if Achilles is a wicked man, surely we can't use Homer, or at least an unadulterated, uncensored Homer, to teach our guardians. It will teach our guardians to do bad things. I don't want the guardians sulking in their tents if they have a slave girl taken away. I want them out here when they're told. If we are going to do that, the only way to do that will be to get the guardians a new set of poets. We will have our own poets to supersede Homer, or we'll give them the expurgated version of Homer, in which Homer tells people to do really nice things or really virtuous things. In other words, those times when Homer stumbles upon the moral truth, we will certainly make everyone learn Homer. Those parts of Homer in which the Homeric heroes do bad things, we will get rid of it. So we'll have the censorship of the poets. It is an anti-liberal, anti-modern idea. Plato was not trying to write legislation for the modern world. He was trying to write legislation for post-Peloponnesian War Athens that lost the Peloponnesian War largely because they overextended themselves, because they were full of hubris and pride and foolish stuff like that. One of the things that Plato most objects to in contemporary Athenian politics is the fact that we went and developed an empire which caused us to lose that war and caused us to get devastated, and we were trying to control other people. We couldn't even control ourselves. Plato wants to show us how to control ourselves, and after we control ourselves and organize our own souls, he wants the city that we participate in to be similarly organized. And then possibly we may extend if we feel a need or a necessity, but that's not our big goal. Our goal is self-control, not the control of others. We want to organize the internal reality, not the external reality. Soul comes first in Plato. You should keep that in mind. Now, at the end of Book 3, Socrates introduces the myth of metals, another anti-enlightenment idea. The myth of metals is also connected to the noble lie. Now this is going to take some finessing because Plato and Socrates are great friends of the truth. What makes a noble lie noble? You would think that lies would be evil because they're not truthful. What can we do with the idea of the noble lie? Well, the noble lie is this. We're supposed to tell the people that we have given the various kinds of training. We train some people to be bronze and craftsmen. We train other people to be silver and defenders of the society. And we're eventually also going to train one or a small group of people to be philosopher kings, to be professional knowers who are also going to run the society. How are we going to keep these three parts of the city separate, and how are we going to keep one from trying to move into the status of another? How are we going to prevent social mobility, in a sense? Well, Socrates wants to do it with a noble lie. He wants to do it by saying, look, you are all brothers and sisters. You all came from the earth. You're all born in the earth. And in the process of forming you, in some cases the god put in gold, which makes you philosopher kings. In other cases, the god put in silver, that makes you guardians, particularly the warriors or defenders. And everyone else is, in fact, bronze. And everyone should be satisfied with their lot, so it's a completely hierarchical society with just about nothing in the way of social mobility. If a child born of bronze or silver parents shows great promise, it can be moved up a notch, or a child of gold parents can be moved, or silver parents can be moved down a notch. But for the most part, it's a completely fixed, rigid, hierarchical society. And Plato thinks that not everyone has equal access to knowledge and reason. And for that reason, he doesn't adopt the kind of open society that would be advocated by someone like Karl Popper, but also any of the Enlightenment thinkers. He doesn't have that optimistic idea that, yeah, if you just give everybody education, everyone will understand what they should do, and they'll all be able to vote for good governments. Plato doesn't think that. He saw this early democracy kill Socrates. He saw this early democracy do all kinds of evil. He saw this early democracy make bad decisions and lose the Peloponnesian War and get themselves all killed and conquered. So he thinks that democracy is an intrinsically unstable polity. If you look at any of his treatments of the demos, think about the Euthydemus, when all the people of Athens that are listening to this eristic dialogue are all clapping and saying that this is a great thing. Obviously, people that think that that's real reasoning are not going to be able to make wise political decisions. That's going to be in the hands of a tiny elite in Plato's ideal city. So what we're going to have here is careful censorship of epic poetry, and also tragedy and comedy. Remember that Aristophanes gave Socrates a very bad name. It was one of the reasons that Socrates was condemned. All poetry will be censored and supervised by the guardians. They will decide what myths the people will get and what they won't get. The point being that this will give them a good education. Good education will result in good souls. Good souls result in an orderly life, and an orderly life means an orderly city. What we are trying to do is avoid the faction that we get based upon bad education and also based upon tremendous disparities in wealth. One of the most interesting facts about Plato's ideas in the third book is that the elite, for the first time, or perhaps for the first time in the history of the world, is going to be an ascetic elite. It's not necessarily that they're going to fast or starve, but the gold and silver, the small strata that actually run society, are not allowed to own any private property. They're not allowed to have their own families. They're not allowed to get married. They're not allowed to actually touch gold and silver. So they are going to be separated off. And that means, I mean, if you know Marx, that Plato's elite is going to extract the smallest possible amount of surplus value. In other words, the gold and the silver only get subsistence wages. And that means out of the gross national product or the gross civic product, the smallest possible slice of the pie is given to the people that actually have the political power, which means that the maximally large slice of the pie goes back to the people that actually produce it, the actual craftsmen and workers. What this means is that in the economic sense, not in the political sense, but in the economic sense, this is the least oppressive regime possible. Because every other regime, the ruling elite, takes out more than a minimum subsistence. And since everything comes from someplace, it has to come from the backs of the workers. Here, the bronze people, the craftsmen, the people that actually produce things, the farmers, are going to be the ones that get back the maximum possible return on their labor. So in that respect, strictly in the sense of the extraction of surplus value, it will be the least oppressive of regimes. On the other hand, there will be nothing in the way of political democracy. This is a regime that's clearly top-down in every case. Now, this is a very radical idea. This is truly the most radical set of political proposals in the history of the West. And Adeimantus at the beginning of Book 4 says, Socrates, look, you have the gold and the silver, and they get the smallest slice of the pie possible, elsewise, they would starve. They're never going to be happy. How are you going to make a happy ruling elite? Because Adeimantus is interested in joining the Athenian ruling elite, and he comes from a wealthy family, and he'd like to be happy. And he says, look, they're not going to be happy unless they have nice big houses and lots of food and nice things. I mean, why can't they have any possessions? That doesn't make any sense. Socrates says, no. The point of this regime is not the good of some subset, it's the good of the whole. He thinks of his ideal city as being a sort of organic unity. So we're not trying to make the hand happy or the head happy or the foot happy. We want the happiness of the entire body. And the way to do that is to have each element in society perform its function and not do anything else. This comes back to the idea of telos. Plato and Socrates are very much concerned with the idea of telos, which means purpose or function. Each element in society, the gold, the silver, and the bronze, is to perform its own function and not any other function. And if it performs that function, it will perform that function well. And if it leaves the other functions alone, something else will perform that function. This is what justice is, or at least one of the provisional definitions of justice. Each part of the society, like each part of the soul, performing that function which it is naturally suited to perform. So the bronze people will have the function of producing the necessities of life, and they will get back as much as possibly can, and they'll be kept in an orderly, safe city. The bronze part of the individual human soul, the part that has appetites and desires, the desire for food, the desire for clothing, the desire for warmth, the desire for sex, the desire for all the things that people want, that will correspond to that. And the appropriate virtue to the bronze people in society and the appropriate virtue to the human soul is moderation. You want to have some control or organization of your emotions, of your desires. You don't want to abolish them. We wouldn't be human if we lacked all human desire. But to be virtuous, both as individuals and as a city, we must organize our desiring parts. The silver part, Plato calls the spirited. In the city, that's going to be the defenders, the actual warriors that will be raised for war from the very beginning. And this, in many respects, borrows the best elements of Sparta and brings them into Athens. Remember that Sparta won the Peloponnesian War, and for Plato to write so many Spartan customs into his ideal city is a real slap in the face to his contemporaries, because saying, look, the reason that Sparta overcame Athens in the Peloponnesian War, at least partially, is because they are more virtuous than we are. Their institutions are better conceived. So many of the ideas that we're going to see in Sparta, like a common housing, common training table, this community of property and community of activity, at least for the young and for the vigorous, for the warriors, derived directly from Sparta, and is the kind of thing that will not be accepted gladly among the Athenians. The final element in the city and the soul is the gold element. The gold element is the philosopher kings in the city, the particularly wise and virtuous rulers that have seen the form of the good, that understand true political knowledge. And that part in the soul is the reasoning capacity. So there's a definite correspondence between the three parts of the soul and the three parts of the city, because the city is like the man. That similarly runs all through the Republic. By the time we get to the end of Book 4, we finished off the education of the guardians, and we get the Platonic virtues. And this is the best statement of Plato's conception of the happy soul and the happy city. It turns out that justice is a combination of the wise, the courageous, and the moderate. You know, the three parts of the soul and the three virtues appropriate to those parts of the soul. And their harmonious interaction is what we mean by justice. So justice is a kind of harmony between the virtues of the three parts of the soul. Now go back when you read the Republic and note the fact that Adeimantus is a very moderate, austere man, and his brother Glaucon is most brave in all things. Adeimantus is the best of the desiring parts. He's the embodiment of moderation. Glaucon is the embodiment of courage. He's most brave in all things. He talks about swords and war all the time. And Socrates is the embodiment of wisdom. And this harmonious interaction in books 2, 3, 4, and 5 of Glaucon, Adeimantus, and Socrates is justice. In other words, it's the harmonious interaction of the wise, the courageous, the moderate, and the just. That doesn't exhaust the symbolism here by any means. What we get in the Republic is a sort of multivalent symbolism where one symbol piles upon another. So, but at least within the confines of books 2 through 5, wisdom, courage, moderation is Socrates, Glaucon, and Adeimantus, and their interaction is justice, which leads them to knowledge of justice. Right, there's quite a bit going on. It's a very busy set of books. Now, at the end of Book 4, we've pretty much established the Platonic virtues, the wise, the courageous, the moderate, and the just. We figured out the parts of the soul, the parts of the city, and we found out that justice is to the soul as health is to the body. But now, a very curious thing happens. A very important passage is going to be found at the beginning of the 5th book. It's the only passage where Polemarchus and Thrasymachus are brought back in, and only for a very brief piece, and Adeimantus steps in. What happens is this. Beginning of the 5th book, and I should emphasize that there were no books back then. They were all put on scrolls. Scholars broke this up into 10 books for their utility. Well, beginning of the 5th book, Polemarchus whispers something into the ear of Adeimantus, and Adeimantus says, yeah, I will ask him, fine. Adeimantus bravely steps forward. Now, this is out of character for Adeimantus. Adeimantus hasn't been interested in war and stuff like that. He's been a very moderate, restrained, kind of quiet figure, very austere. But he steps forward and bravely says, Socrates, I'm arresting you for a second time. It's a recapitulation of that first scene in the 1st book. He steps in and says, Socrates, don't go anywhere. We thought you were going to tell us about this strange business about the community of women and the abolition of the family and the abolition of private property and all this strange stuff that you're suggesting. And now you want to go right on to the degenerate regimes. And now that you've given us the good regime, tell us about the bad one. No. We insist that you stay, you stop right now, and you explain to us all this business about communism and about the abolition of private property and the abolition of the family and all this stuff that strikes us as very peculiar. Well, Socrates says, I didn't want to get involved with this, which can be read ironically, but possibly also is true as well. He said, it's a very difficult thing you're asking me to do because I'm afraid of being overwhelmed by the waves of the argument. Well, Glaucon, who is most brave in all things, comes back and says, look, speak away. We won't hold anything against you. Come on, let's hear what you got. Well, this is, I guess, the most radical departures that we're going to get in the Republic, Book 5. He says there are 3 waves to the argument, and if you thought my argument was strange to begin with and hard to believe to begin with, it's going to get even harder to believe and even more peculiar. The first wave that Socrates has to face is feminism. Remember that we're talking about 25 centuries ago, and the status of women was, not even approximately or remotely equal to that of men. They were kept secured away in a women's quarter within the households. They didn't engage in public life. They certainly didn't go to war. And Socrates is suggesting that men and women should get the same education. Now, if they get the same education, we can only assume that they're going to be performing the same sort of functions in society, and it appears that they are. Socrates, remember, is primarily interested in minds, not bodies. And women, when they do arithmetic or geometry, they get the same answer that men do. And what that means is they have the divine logos in them. And of course, Plato is going to take that the whole way. He says, look, bodies are relatively accidental things. And God knows at the end of the book, at the myth of Ur, we're going to find out that people are going to get reincarnated anyway. Right? So naturally, he doesn't care what sort of genitalia a person is attached to. He cares about their mind, their psyche, their soul. This is a book about souls, the perfectibility of souls. Bodies don't interest him very much. So he's going to say men and women have to get the same education, and apart from strictly physical things, like heavy lifting, they're going to have the same functions in society. Makes sense. Our dogs, both the male and the female, must be given the same job, guarding the sheep. And our dogs, in the bronze area or in the gold area, are going to have to get the same education appropriate to their status. And that way we can have eugenics and all that other kind of stuff. So the first wave of the argument is feminism, which is a completely radical idea. And it's the first of the great, he's the first of the great feminist authors in the Western tradition, right? Why? Because he emphasizes mind over body. The second wave is communism. He's going to completely abolish the family, which is surely, even more radical than feminism. The family is one of those lasting institutions that, however we modify it, it seems to be here to stay. He says, no. If we're going to have really the best people in the society, the guardians, particularly the philosopher kings, must create phony lots so that we have eugenic marriages, so that we have the best men and the best women reproduce, so that the next generation will be even superior to the generation that we have now. So we're going to have a gradual program of eugenics, and this eugenics program will be carried on surreptitiously, and it will give people that much more of a stimulus to do well, because it turns out that the people that behave well and perform well are the ones that we end up breeding. So they will live a very austere life, and the idea is this. Plato wants to break down the distinction between public good and private good. That's why he's abolishing the family in the interest of creating family ties or family relationships across the city as a whole. In other words, all the members of the guardian class, all the silver and all the gold, should view the whole city as being their own, their family, their particular private thing. So private and public good will be unified. And I don't know that it is successful, this attempt to abolish the family in the interest of creating a kind of general cohesion within society. On the other hand, one of the persistent problems that we get in modern liberal society is this conflict between the private good and the public good. Right? We haven't really resolved this. So I would be inclined to think this is an especially plausible way of resolving it, by abolishing the family, although people have tried that. The point is, though, that it remains a problem, and even if his solution is not satisfactory, to identify this conflict between public and private good as a basic political problem is, I think, a real advance here. Now, the third of these waves, and the last of the waves that Socrates deals with, and the waves are getting bigger all the time. Feminism was a big wave. You can be washed away by that. Surely a very peculiar idea for 400 BC or 380 BC. The abolition of the family, even more radical. But the final one is the practicality of the philosopher king. Here's the problem. Plato says, well, look, or Glaucon says, okay, I'm convinced that this is a great achievement, and that you've shown me something very important. I feel in some ways bad about this the argument that I proposed, that maybe it's better to be good, to be evil than to be good. Now that I look at justice and injustice, I've really made a mistake. But is this philosopher king really possible? Can we have this kind of a city? And it seems that there's a sort of resistance by the empirical, physical world of tables and chairs towards all of Platonic ideals and towards the perfect city that Plato suggests. And the philosopher king suggests to us that there's some sort of disjunction between theory and practice, that we can't quite realize in the world of space and time, the world of nature, the ideals that we would hope or that we would aspire towards. Now, it seems then that this idea of the philosopher king has some kind of big problem attached to it. In other words, if our theory can't be brought into practice, that gives us the idea that something is drastically amiss. And that's true. According to Plato, the fact that we cannot realize the good regime, that we cannot realize the philosopher king, that we cannot create perfect justice in this world, shows us that something is very definitely wrong with this world.